There is a terrifying silence that falls over a stadium when an entire nation collectively realizes that they are watching something fundamentally impossible. It isn't just about the skill or the tactical superiority. It is the atmosphere of cold, surgical inevitability that radiates from the pitch. Think back to the sheer, suffocating psychological weight of this team. They didn't just play football. They performed an act of total domination that left opponents feeling smaller, slower, and psychologically beaten before the opening whistle had even echoed through the stands. To witness them at their zenith was to witness the death of hope for the opposition. They operated with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, a machine built from muscle, bone, and ironclad belief that refused to acknowledge the concept of an equal. But how does a collection of individuals transcend the human limitations of the sport to become something that felt, to every person watching, like a force of nature? The highlights show you the goals, the tackles, and the lifted trophies, but they fail to capture the suffocating dread they instilled in the tunnel. The statistics tell a story of cold numbers, unbeaten streaks that defied mathematical probability, goal differentials that mocked defensive structures, and clean sheets maintained with a disdainful ease. Yet, numbers are only the surface layer of a much deeper, far more complex architectural project. This team was not an accident of generation. It was the result of a deliberate, long-term psychological conditioning process that viewed the football pitch as a laboratory for intimidation. They studied the opposition not just to find tactical weaknesses, but to map the exact threshold where a professional athlete's confidence would shatter under sustained, high-intensity pressure. They knew that if you break a player's will in the first 15 minutes, the remaining 75 are merely a formality, a scripted procession toward an inevitable result. We look back at the archives today, scouring the footage for the how, and we see the grace, the power, and the terrifying intelligence of their play. But there is always a gap between what we see on the screen and the reality of the experience. There is a hidden history to their preparation, a set of sacrifices and internal costs that never made it into the mainstream narrative. We are about to strip away the myth and reveal the mechanical, calculated reality of why they were truly the scariest national team to ever step onto the world stage. But as we begin this descent into their history, we have to address the question that haunts every great dynasty. When you build a team based on the total suppression of others, how long can you possibly expect to remain standing before the weight of that dominance begins to crush you from within? The answer is as surprising as the rain itself, and it begins with a single, seemingly minor decision that changed the trajectory of the entire program. At the time, nobody questioned the shift. It seemed like a stroke of genius, a simple tactical adjustment that allowed their stars to breathe. But looking at the wreckage left behind years later, it becomes clear that this was the very moment the cracks began to form. They were so busy perfecting the machine that they forgot that the human beings inside it were reaching their breaking point. The intensity was unsustainable. The demand for perfection had evolved from a goal into a religion, and religions, by their very nature, eventually demand a sacrifice. As we prepare to dissect their final tournament, keep this in mind. The scariness of this team wasn't just in what they did to their opponents, but in what they were willing to do to themselves to keep the nightmare alive. What exactly happened behind the curtain? The truth is far darker than the trophies suggest. To truly understand how this team achieved their aura of invincibility, we must look beyond the individual stars and focus on the cold, mechanical philosophy that governed their presence on the field. They didn't just walk onto the pitch, they arrived like an incoming storm, a force that seemed to distort the very geometry of the game around them. While their opponents spent months agonizing over formation adjustments and defensive cover, this team had already moved past the conventional boundaries of tactical planning. They operated on a level of cognitive synchronization that made every pass feel preordained, every run a calculated geometric strike against the opponent's resolve. The opposition managers would often speak in hushed, haunted tones after facing them, admitting that their tactical board felt useless. It wasn't that the opponent didn't know what was coming. It was that knowing offered zero protection against the sheer, relentless nature of the execution. There was a specific, terrifying rhythm to their movement. When they pressed, it wasn't just a physical pursuit of the ball. It was a cage closing in, a tightening of space so precise that the ball carrier had no viable exit. They turned the game into a psychological endurance test where the primary goal wasn't just a score, but to exhaust the opponent's spirit until they simply gave up the ghost. This was the science of intimidation. Every drill in their training camp was designed to simulate the highest levels of competitive stress, creating a culture where failure was not just an error, but an existential threat to one's place in the squad. They were forged in a furnace of high-performance demands that would have fractured any lesser group of men. This internal rigor mirrored the external terror they inflicted on the world. You could see it in the eyes of the defenders they faced, a flickering moment of hesitation the second they realized they were trapped in a 50-50 challenge against a machine that had no concept of self-preservation. They played with a collective, cold-blooded hunger that felt entirely detached from the joy of the game. It was professional, it was ruthless, and it was deeply unsettling to behold. For 90 minutes, they forced the world to watch their brutal, efficient methodology play out, regardless of the quality of the team on the other side. The psychological landscape of their dominance was fueled by a complete lack of empathy for the opposition. In their minds, every match was a conquest, and every goal was a further reinforcement of their status as the apex predator of world football. They weren't looking for a fair contest, they were looking for complete, total submission. And it worked. The fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Before the games even began, the media narrative had already shifted from who will win to how many will they score. This shift in perception was the final piece of their tactical armory. By the time they walked out of the tunnel, the game was already half won in the minds of the men wearing the opposing colors. The sheer weight of their reputation preceded them, acting as a mental anchor that dragged their opponents down before a single tackle was made. There was a profound sense of isolation to their dominance. They didn't interact with the media like other teams. They didn't engage in the pageantry of the tournament. They were a closed system, self-sufficient and entirely preoccupied with their own internal standards of perfection. This detachment was another layer of the terror. It made them feel inhuman, untouchable, and beyond the reach of the standard emotions that govern the rest of the footballing world. They were an enigma that only became clearer as the body count of defeated nations grew longer. And while the world marveled at their efficiency, they were simultaneously being repulsed by the lack of humanity in the way they dismantled their peers. They were a team that played as if they were already legends, erasing the present by force of will. But the higher they climbed, the more distance they placed between themselves and the sport they were supposed to be elevating. The question that started to circulate in the deeper circles of the footballing elite was not if they could be beaten, but how much they were willing to sacrifice to ensure that day never arrived. They were operating on a razor's edge, a thin line between revolutionary perfection and an impending implosion that would redefine the narrative of their entire legacy. The pressure to maintain this level of intimidation was becoming a weight that even the strongest among them were starting to feel, and as the tournament reached its midpoint, the first subtle signs of fatigue began to manifest in the one place they couldn't afford to be vulnerable: their internal hierarchy. The transition from a collection of exceptionally talented players to a monolithic, state-sponsored terror was not a product of luck. It was an act of cold, architectural planning. This team didn't just understand football, they understood the mechanics of the ecosystem they existed within. While other nations were still debating the merits of defensive stability versus attacking flair, this team had reached a point of tactical synthesis where the ball was merely an instrument, and their teammates were components of a singular, moving intelligence. You could see the fear in the faces of their adversaries as early as the first 5 minutes of play. There was a recognizable, rhythmic thrum to their movement, an almost mechanical precision that seemed to drain the atmosphere of the stadium of its oxygen. They didn't just want to control the possession, they wanted to strip the opponent of their agency. Every touch of the ball by an opposing defender was met with a swarm of pressure so perfectly choreographed that it bordered on the cruel. They weren't just playing for a goal, they were playing to extinguish the possibility of resistance. It started in the domestic leagues, a quiet, growing realization that the rules had changed. Players who were giants in their own right, who had commanded respect in the most hostile environments in Europe, looked diminished, paralyzed by the realization that their standard responses no longer worked. The team had effectively created a new, higher altitude version of the game that no one else was prepared to breathe in. The coaching staff had implemented a system of total accountability, where every player, regardless of their star power, was subjected to a level of scrutiny that made the pitch feel like a courtroom. If you missed a tracking run, if you chose the wrong passing angle, or if you showed a momentary lapse in concentration, you were pulled from a training session immediately. This fear of internal failure was the engine that kept the external terror alive. They were constantly playing against the invisible standard of their own perfection, and because they feared the disapproval of their own ranks more than they feared any opponent, they were essentially immune to the pressures of the big match. The sheer, physical nature of their conditioning was a secret weapon that remained largely ignored until it was far too late for the rest of the world. They had invested heavily in biometric monitoring, tracking everything from heart rate variability to sleep patterns, ensuring that their collective physical peak was perfectly timed to coincide with the start of the tournament. They weren't just healthier, they were systematically superior in every measurable metric of speed and endurance. When the tournament began, the rest of the world looked like they were running through quicksand by comparison. Opponents were being dismantled by the 60th minute of every single game, their legs failing them while the machine showed no signs of degradation. This wasn't just physical dominance, it was the total invalidation of the opponent's preparation. They had done the work that nobody else was willing to do, and they wore the exhaustion of their peers as a trophy. This was the height of their arrogance, but it was a justified arrogance. They knew, and the world knew, that they were operating in a reality entirely separate from the rest of the competition. The media began to run out of adjectives to describe them, eventually resorting to celestial metaphors, comparing their play to celestial alignments or unstoppable planetary forces. Yet, beneath this veneer of godlike invulnerability, the cracks were already starting to form, hidden from the public eye but painfully visible to those within the organization. The intensity that fueled their terror was beginning to grate against the delicate social fabric of the dressing room. Players were forming factions, silently resenting the constant, mechanical pressure to be anything less than absolute. There was a fragility to their synergy, a reliance on total belief that was one major mistake away from shattering. They were like a finely tuned engine running at redline speed, capable of reaching impossible velocity, but vulnerable to the smallest grain of sand in the gears. The world saw a perfect, terrifying team, but behind the closed doors, the human cost of that perfection was finally starting to pile up, making them more brittle than the world could ever know. By the time the quarterfinal match arrived, the air surrounding the team had changed. It was no longer just the focus of elite professionals. It was the heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere of destiny. They were no longer playing against their opponents. They were playing against the historical record, trying to erase every mark of mediocrity that had preceded them. The coaching staff had refined their system of total accountability until it became a rigid, uncompromising doctrine. Every player on the pitch moved as if tethered to the others by invisible, unbreakable steel cables. When the left back pushed forward, the defensive midfielder dropped into the vacuum, a shadow replacing a shadow. It was the most beautiful, terrifying orchestration of space that any of us had ever witnessed in a modern international tournament. The opposing side, a team respected for their technical prowess and gritty determination, looked fundamentally broken from the first minute of play. They weren't just losing battles in the midfield, they were losing their sense of purpose. Every time they managed to secure the ball, the immediate, swarming pressure exerted by the team felt less like a tactical choice and more like a physical manifestation of dominance. The psychological toll was instantaneous. You could see the fear etched on the faces of the opposing strikers as they realized that even the most desperate, long-range passes were being tracked and intercepted with robotic ease. There was a moment in the first half, a simple, routine interception by the team's anchor, that essentially silenced the entire stadium. The ease with which he stepped into the passing lane, the way he didn't even celebrate or acknowledge the disruption, communicated a chilling message. We're not here to compete, we are here to process you. It was this absolute, detached professionalism that unnerved everyone. They didn't smile, they didn't waste time on excessive celebrations, and they didn't treat their opponents with the usual, performative respect that masks the brutality of professional competition. They looked like they were working a shift at a factory, and the product they were building was the total annihilation of their rival's identity. This efficiency was the ultimate realization of the tactical blueprints outlined in, where every movement is accounted for, leaving absolutely no margin for human error. It was as if the pitch itself had become a stage where their victory had already been mathematically calculated, and they were simply going through the motions to fulfill the equation. The fans, initially excited by the prospect of a high-level clash, began to feel a strange, hollow sensation. The game had lost its fundamental humanity. It had become a display of raw, unrestrained power that made the passion of the tournament feel misplaced, even slightly naive. As the first goal went in, a clinical, emotionless strike that left the opposing goalkeeper frozen in his spot, the collective confidence of the opposition completely evaporated. They knew, as every person in the stadium knew, that they were witnessing the peak of a terrifying cycle. The narrative surrounding the team had shifted from respectful admiration to something far more visceral. They were no longer just winning games, they were erasing the possibility of competition from the public consciousness. As the tournament moved into the final stages of the group phase, the rest of the world began to witness a display of athletic arrogance that felt entirely unprecedented. It wasn't that they were scoring more goals than everyone else, it was the manner in which they did it. There was a deliberate, almost mocking pace to their game. They would concede possession in non-threatening areas, allow the opponent to press, and then, with a single, sudden transition, dismantle their structure in 3 passes. It was a game of cat and mouse played by a predator that had grown bored of its prey. The opposing players would leave the field in a state of visible shell shock, their eyes darting around as if trying to comprehend the sheer speed and fluidity of the team that had just dismantled them. The team moved as a singular, living organism, oblivious to the external clamor, fueled only by the internal clockwork of their own tactical perfection. The fear, by now, had bled into the press. Journalists who had built their careers on the nuance of tactical analysis were left speechless, finding themselves unable to critique a team that had seemingly solved the game of football. They were being compared to historical titans of the sport, but even those comparisons felt inadequate. This team wasn't merely historical, they were an evolutionary leap, a glimpse into a future where football would be dominated by the hyper-efficient, the physically elite, and the psychologically bulletproof. This sense of hopelessness among the media and the fans created a vacuum of joy, where the excitement of the World Cup was replaced by the grim anticipation of the next inevitable execution. It was a heavy, somber atmosphere that seemed to follow them from city to city, a dark cloud of superiority that stifled the spontaneity of the tournament. The tournament organizers, hoping for a celebration of the sport's diversity and flair, were instead left managing the fallout of a spectacle that had become a one-sided, mechanical exhibition. What made their dominance so scarier than any dynasty that came before was the absence of vanity. There was no grandstanding, no individualistic posturing, and no moments of weakness where an opponent could find a foothold to challenge their resolve. They were a team of disciplined, cold-blooded professionals who seemed to have purged themselves of all the messy, human emotions that usually lead to upsets and tactical collapses. They operated under a code of conduct that prioritized the function of the machine over the ego of the individual. If a player scored a hat-trick, he didn't run to the corner flag to celebrate. He jogged back to the center circle, eyes fixed on the next kickoff, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying focus. This display of total emotional regulation was the final piece of their tactical armory. It sent a message to the world that they were not playing for the fans, for the glory, or for the history books. They were playing to fulfill a mandate of perfection that had been imposed upon them from within. However, beneath this veneer of absolute, unshakable control, the human toll of such a project was beginning to manifest in the one place they couldn't control, the quiet, private moments of their downtime. The fatigue was no longer just physical. It was a deepening, mental exhaustion that threatened to crack the foundation of their synchronization. The constant, relentless focus required to sustain such a high level of intimidation was a heavy burden, one that each player carried in total isolation. They were winning, they were making history, and they were the most feared team to ever grace the tournament, but they were also, increasingly, a group of men living in the shadow of their own expectations. As the next round of matches approached, the team that looked like gods from the outside was starting to feel the first, subtle tremors of a potential internal collapse. The pressure was mounting, and the machine, perfect as it was beginning to vibrate with the strain of holding its own perfection together. Every victory, instead of easing the pressure, only added to the terrifying expectation that they could never, under any circumstances, allow themselves to be human. They were trapped in the cage of their own success, waiting for the one mistake that would finally reveal the humans behind the masks. By the time the round of 16 commenced, the atmosphere surrounding the tournament had been irrevocably altered by the presence of this squad. The initial shock of their dominance in the group stages had calcified into a collective, morbid fascination. Every opposing manager, every player, and every analyst knew exactly what was coming, yet there was an eerie sense that no amount of preparation could actually change the outcome. The knockouts are supposed to be the moment where the beautiful game reveals its most human qualities, the moments of desperation, the miraculous turnarounds, the unscripted glory of the underdog. But as this team stepped onto the pitch for their first elimination game, they seemed intent on stripping those qualities away. They approached the knockout phase with the same cold, analytical intensity that had defined their warm-up friendlies, treating the World Cup final bracket as a series of bureaucratic obstacles that simply needed to be cleared with minimal resource expenditure. The sheer volume of their output was staggering. Their possession stats in the first half of the round of 16 were not just high, they were oppressive, preventing the opponent from even registering a shot on goal. This was a form of footballing warfare designed to keep the opponent in a perpetual state of defensive panic. While the world looked for signs of a human element, a missed pass, a moment of misplaced anger, or a lapse in tactical discipline, the squad provided none. They functioned as a closed loop, an isolated environment where the only thing that mattered was the internal rhythm of their machine. This isolation was, in itself, a weapon. By refusing to engage in the emotional theater that usually accompanies a World Cup knockout run, they forced their opponents to play against a void. There was no trash talk, no intimidation tactics in the media, just a deafening, disciplined silence that felt more threatening than any overt act of aggression could ever be. As the match progressed and the inevitable goals began to accumulate, the opposition players started to fold in ways that were uncomfortable to witness. It was as if they had internalized the pre-game narrative of their own inferiority and had stopped competing entirely. You could see the resignation in their body language, the way they stood around the pitch as if they were already waiting for the final whistle to end their public humiliation. This absolute, total submission was the ultimate victory for the machine. It wasn't just about advancing to the next round. It was about the total, psychological displacement of the rival identity. They weren't just winning games, they were defining the reality of the tournament, leaving no space for any other narrative to take root. The tournament, which had started as a celebration of the sport's diversity, was being squeezed into the narrow, singular vision of this one, terrifying team. However, deep within their internal data logs and private tactical assessments, the team's leadership was beginning to record a disturbing trend. The cost of maintaining this mechanical perfection was skyrocketing. The physical data captured by their sensors during the second half of that game showed that the players were operating at a cardiac and muscular load that was statistically unsustainable for a tournament of this length. They were running on a reserve tank of nervous system adrenaline, a high-octane mix of fear and discipline that was beginning to cause micro-tears in the team's cohesion. The coaching staff, blinded by the success of their own system, viewed these metrics as mere calibration issues to be corrected with more training, more rigor, and more isolation. They were failing to see the difference between a high-performing professional athlete and a piece of software that could be patched to run faster. The team was winning, the world was watching in awe, but the human beings inside the machine were starting to feel the grinding metal of the system they had built. They were now the undisputed monsters of the tournament, but the monster was starting to feed on its own internal reserves, and the final stages of the path to the championship would soon reveal just how much of their humanity they were willing to sacrifice to reach the final peak of their own, self-imposed mountain. As the tournament progressed into the deep waters of the semifinals, the psychological landscape shifted yet again. The team's dominance, once a source of awe, was beginning to transform into something far more burdensome, the absolute expectation of flawlessness. They were no longer playing to win. They were playing to sustain a narrative of perfection that had become a prison. Every pass was scrutinized by millions of viewers not just for its technical value, but for its adherence to the machine-like standard they had set in the group stages. The players could sense this transition in the collective consciousness. It was no longer enough to win 2-0. They had to dominate, they had to intimidate, and they had to do it without losing their composure for a single second. The pressure was no longer external. It had been internalized. Each member of the starting 11 was acutely aware that their individual legacy was now tied to the survival of the dynasty. One bad game, one tactical error, or one moment of human frailty would be enough to collapse the entire structure they had spent months building. This intensity was bleeding into their daily preparation. The practice sessions, which were already legendary for their rigor, had become scenes of quiet, simmering friction. Players who had previously been the bedrock of their defensive organization were now snapping at each other over the smallest miscommunications, their frayed nerves revealing the cracks in a system that demanded perfection from fallible human beings. The coaching staff, instead of offering an emotional outlet, doubled down on the technical demands, convinced that the only way to manage the mounting pressure was to exert even tighter control over the team's environment. They essentially built a wall around the squad, restricting outside contact and monitoring their private lives with a level of invasiveness that would have been unacceptable in any other context. The team had become an insular, paranoid collective, entirely detached from the joy that usually serves as the heartbeat of a World Cup campaign. Yet, despite this internal fraying, their performance on the pitch remained undeniably terrifying. When they stepped out for the semi-final, they played with a ferocity that seemed designed to silence any whispers of vulnerability. They dismantled their opponents with a clinical, almost robotic detachment. It was the peak of their athletic intimidation. They forced the opposition into submission through pure, unadulterated territorial control, pinning them in their own half until the goal became an inevitability rather than a possibility. The crowd, sensing the cold, inescapable nature of the result, became increasingly quiet as the game wore on. There was no joy in the stands, only the uneasy awareness that they were watching a historical force of nature that was rapidly approaching its own expiration date. The opposition players looked less like competitors and more like witnesses to their own destruction, unable to find an answer to a tactical riddle that had been rewritten to guarantee their failure. Behind this wall of intimidation, however, the human element was screaming to be let out. There were glimpses of this suppressed reality: a striker who stared too long at the bench after being substituted, a defensive leader who walked off the pitch without acknowledging his teammates, small, telling moments that indicated the consensus was beginning to drift. The machine was technically perfect, but it was losing its synchronization with the people operating the controls. The final was now clearly in sight, but the question that permeated the team's internal communication was no longer about strategy or tactical superiority. It was about whether they could survive the next 90 minutes without the entire project disintegrating in the eyes of the world. They were carrying the weight of an entire nation's expectations, the crushing pressure of their own history, and the hidden, personal grievances that had accumulated during their long, isolated camp. They were the scariest team on the planet, but they were also the most fragile entity in the tournament, held together by the thin, fraying thread of their collective, enforced silence. The stage for the final had been set, but the actors were starting to forget their lines, and the audience was beginning to suspect that the tragedy was about to become very, very real. As the semi-final concluded and the team secured their place in the tournament final, the atmosphere shifted from triumphant to something far more ominous. The world had expected them to be happy, to be celebratory, to bask in the glory of another brutal, clinical victory. Instead, what we saw on the tunnel cameras was a group of men who looked as though they had just survived a war rather than won a football match. The silence that had become their trademark was now heavy with the weight of the expectations they had generated themselves. They were the inevitable champions, the unstoppable force of nature that the world had learned to fear, but that fear was beginning to boomerang back on them. They were no longer just playing against other nations. They were playing against the crushing, relentless burden of their own perfection. Every citizen in their home country, every sponsor, and every media pundit was projecting their own hopes and anxieties onto them, treating this final not as a sporting event, but as a moral imperative. The training sessions in the days leading up to the final were stark, minimalist affairs that stripped away any semblance of joy or release. The coaching staff, driven by the same singular, pathological obsession that had guided them from the start, pushed the intensity even further. It was as if they believed that if they squeezed the players hard enough, they could refine the remaining traces of humanity out of them, leaving behind only the pure, functioning mechanisms of the machine. But in the quiet hours, away from the watchful eyes of the scouts and the cameras, the reality was different. The team's internal hierarchy, once a bedrock of discipline, was now starting to buckle under the strain. There were late-night meetings where voices were raised, where the veneer of total professional detachment finally cracked, revealing the raw, personal exhaustion of men who had been running on empty for weeks. They were starting to realize that the machine they had built was not sustainable, and more terrifyingly, they weren't sure if they were still the ones in control of it. This internal fracturing was a secret known only to the inner circle, but the signs were starting to leak out. A tactical blunder in a closed-door drill, a missed assignment during a routine set-piece rehearsal. These were small, meaningless errors for any other team, but for them, they were systemic failures. The coaching staff viewed these glitches as threats to the entire project, responding with an escalation of rhetoric that further alienated the players. The sense of isolation grew so profound that the team stopped feeling like a brotherhood and started feeling like a collection of high-functioning employees forced to work a shift in a crumbling, high-pressure environment. They weren't fighting for each other anymore. They were fighting to maintain the illusion that they were still the dominant, terrifying force that had arrived at the tournament weeks prior. The media continued to pump out the narrative of their invincibility, feeding the public's appetite for a historic coronation, unaware that the team they were lionizing was essentially a shell. The players were trapped in a narrative of their own making, unable to admit that they were tired, that they were angry, or that they were ready for this to end. The sponsorship obligations, the media appearances, and the sheer volume of global attention only served to amplify the disconnect between the image the world saw and the reality the players lived. They had become the scariest team in history, not because they were necessarily better than the legends that preceded them, but because they had successfully engineered an environment where human error was treated as a crime. And as they prepared for the final 90 minutes, the silence in the hotel hallways was not the silence of calm focus. It was the silence of a group of people waiting for a bomb to go off. They had sacrificed their individual joys, their personal comfort, and their psychological freedom to reach this precipice, and they were beginning to realize that the view from the top of the mountain was much lonelier and far colder than anyone had promised. The final was no longer a reward, it was a deadline. The tension in the air leading up to the final was no longer the focused, cold intensity of a squad on the brink of glory. It was the frantic, brittle energy of an organization attempting to hold a crumbling infrastructure together with duct tape and willpower. The team, previously seen as a singular entity of terrifying, robotic precision, was beginning to show signs of internal divergence. In the locker room, the dynamic had shifted from one of discipline hierarchy to one of heavy, unspoken resentment. The players were not just physically drained from the relentless demands of their coaching staff, they were cognitively and emotionally exhausted by the expectation that they remained superhuman. The machine they had become, the one that had dismantled their opponents with such brutal ease, was now starting to grind against the very people who had created it. There were instances of uncharacteristic dissent during tactical meetings, small but significant lapses in the communication loops that had been their greatest strength, and an overall sense of withdrawal from the stars who had once carried them through the storm. The media, still blinded by the narrative of invincibility, failed to pick up on these signals, projecting an image of calm, professional focus onto a group that was actually struggling to keep their collective identity intact. They were effectively managing a psychological crisis in real time, all while maintaining the outward appearance of the most dominant force the sport had ever seen. The fear they had instilled in their opponents was real, but the fear they now felt within their own ranks was becoming the true story of the tournament. They were paralyzed by the thought of falling short of their own self-imposed standards, terrified that their eventual collapse would be viewed as a catastrophic failure of character rather than the inevitable result of human limitation. The coaching staff, increasingly detached from the reality of their squad's mental state, continued to increase the pressure, convinced that only through absolute control could they guarantee the final prize. This escalation was the final, fatal error. It turned the final into a test of loyalty rather than a test of skill, and as the players stood in the tunnel before the ultimate match, they felt less like gladiators and more like captives of their own success. Their dominance had always been predicated on their ability to suppress the individual for the benefit of the whole, but that sacrifice was now demanding a price that the players were no longer willing to pay. The internal conversations in the hotel, the hushed exchanges during training, and the long, silent stares during team meals were all clear indicators that the thread was fraying. They were a team of world-class performers who had been pushed past the point of diminishing returns, and the pressure was forcing them to reckon with the reality that their invincibility was an illusion, a carefully constructed performance that was now reaching its conclusion. The world expected them to dominate, to win, and to finalize their status as legends, but inside the circle, the team was having a very different internal debate. They were asking themselves if the trophy was worth the loss of their own autonomy, their own joy, and the very connection to the sport that had brought them together in the first place. This was the tragedy of their reign. They were trapped in a cycle of perfection that left no room for the genuine humanity that makes sports worth playing. As they stood waiting for the signal to emerge into the blinding lights of the stadium, they felt the full, crushing weight of everything they had been forced to leave behind to get there. They were the most feared team in the competition, but in those final, private seconds, they were just a group of individuals who wanted to be something other than the machine they were expected to be. The stage was set for a dramatic, final confrontation that would test not just their tactical superiority, but the very integrity of the team itself. The world was about to see if the machine could survive the final, most grueling test, or if the humans inside had finally decided to break the system from within. The grand final wasn't just a match, it was the final, desperate act of a dying dynasty, and everyone knew that once the whistle blew, there would be no turning back from the legacy they were about to write in the history books of the game. As the final match of the tournament approached, the atmosphere in the host city was less like a grand sporting celebration and more like the suffocating, controlled silence of a high-stakes corporate takeover. The team had reached the summit, but the view from the top was no longer one of exhilarating triumph. It was a cold, alienating landscape of pure, unadulterated expectation. They were the inevitable champions, the unstoppable force of nature that the world had learned to fear, but that fear was beginning to boomerang back on them with devastating intensity. They were no longer just playing against another nation on a patch of grass. They were playing against the crushing, relentless burden of their own perfection. Every citizen back home, every global sponsor, and every media pundit was projecting their own hopes and anxieties onto them, treating this final not as a sporting event, but as a moral imperative that left no room for error. The players could feel it. The locker room, once a sanctuary of shared purpose, had become a pressure cooker where the lid was beginning to warp. They had successfully built a machine that could dominate any opponent, but they had fundamentally failed to account for the psychological toll of never being allowed to be anything less than absolute. The final days of preparation were stark, minimalist affairs that stripped away any semblance of joy or release. The coaching staff, driven by the same singular, pathological obsession that had guided them from the start, pushed the intensity even further, convinced that if they squeezed the players hard enough, they could refine the remaining traces of humanity out of them, leaving behind only the pure, functioning mechanisms of a championship-winning engine. But in the quiet hours, away from the watchful eyes of the scouts and the cameras, the reality was starkly different. The internal hierarchy, once a bedrock of discipline harmony, was now starting to buckle under the strain. There were late-night meetings where voices were raised, where the veneer of total professional detachment finally cracked, revealing the raw, personal exhaustion of men who had been running on empty for weeks. They were starting to realize that the machine they had built was not sustainable, and more terrifyingly, they weren't sure if they were still the ones in control of it. This internal fracturing was a secret known only to the inner circle, but the signs were starting to leak into their public interactions. A tactical blunder during a closed-door drill, a missed assignment during a routine set-piece rehearsal, or a hollow, vacant look in a superstar's eyes during a press conference. These were small, telling indicators of a squad that was running on a reserve tank of nervous system adrenaline. They were paralyzed by the thought of falling short of their own self-imposed standards, terrified that their eventual collapse would be viewed as a catastrophic failure of character rather than the inevitable result of human limitation. The coaching staff, increasingly detached from the reality of their squad's mental state, continued to increase the pressure, convinced that only through absolute control could they guarantee the final prize. This escalation was the final, fatal error. It turned the final into a test of loyalty rather than a test of skill, and as the players stood in the tunnel before the ultimate match, they felt less like gladiators and more like captives of their own success. They were the scariest team in history, not because they were necessarily better than the legends that preceded them, but because they had successfully engineered an environment where human error was treated as a crime. And as they prepared for the final 90 minutes, the silence in the hotel hallways was not the silence of calm focus. It was the silence of a group of people waiting for a bomb to go off. They had sacrificed their individual joys, their personal comfort, and their psychological freedom to reach this precipice, and they were beginning to realize that the view from the top of the mountain was much lonelier and far colder than anyone had promised. The final was no longer a reward, it was a deadline. The weight of an entire nation's expectations, the crushing pressure of their own history, and the hidden, personal grievances that had accumulated during their long, isolated camp were all colliding at once. They were a team of world-class performers who had been pushed past the point of diminishing returns, and the pressure was forcing them to reckon with the reality that their invincibility was an illusion, a carefully constructed performance that was now reaching its conclusion. The world was watching, the lights were blinding, but for the men in the center of it all, the machine had finally reached its breaking point. The whistle that signaled the start of the final in New Jersey did not bring the clarity that the team had so desperately sought. Instead, it brought a sudden, violent collision with the reality of their own fragility. The stadium, packed to capacity with a global audience expecting a masterclass in domination, became an arena of profound psychological exposure. From the first touch, the team did not look like the invincible juggernaut that had steamrolled its way through the group stages and the knockouts. They looked hesitant. Their movements, once synchronized with the precision of a Swiss watch, were stuttering. Passes that should have been hit with confidence were being telegraphed, and defensive assignments that had been automatic were now requiring frantic, last-minute adjustments. The machine was not just grinding, it was misfiring. For the first time in the entire tournament, they were playing against an opponent who had nothing to lose, and that desperation was proving to be a potent antidote to their aura of inevitability. The opposition attacked with a reckless, joyful abandon that the team simply could not process, their tactical rigidity being dismantled by the very chaos they had worked so hard to eliminate from their game. As the match intensified, the pressure on the individual players, men who had been hollowed out by the coaching staff's relentless, inhuman demands, began to manifest as a visible, physical crumbling on the pitch. The captain, usually the beacon of the team's unwavering composure, was caught out of position multiple times, his frustration palpable as he shouted commands that his teammates no longer seemed to follow. There was a specific, horrifying moment midway through the first half where their defensive structure simply dissolved, a communication breakdown that left their goalkeeper exposed to a clinical finish. When the ball hit the back of the net, the silence that fell over the stadium wasn't just shock, it was the realization that the myth had been debunked. The team that had made the world feel small, terrified, and inferior was human after all. And in that moment of vulnerability, the psychological dam broke. They weren't just losing a game, they were losing the only thing that had given them purpose for the last few months, their perfect, terrifying narrative. The sidelines, usually the center of cold, tactical calculations, turned into a scene of chaotic damage control. The coaches were screaming, their faces contorted with a mixture of disbelief and genuine panic, as they tried to force their players back into the rigid tactical frameworks that had clearly failed. But the players had stopped listening. The mechanical, detached professionalism that had defined their run was replaced by a frantic, jagged scramble to reclaim a momentum that had long since vanished. They were no longer playing to dominate. They were playing to survive the embarrassment of their own unraveling. The fans in the stadium, who had come expecting to witness a coronation, found themselves cheering for the breakdown of the very team they had spent weeks fearing. It was a bizarre, cathartic reversal of energy, where the terror that had hung over the tournament like a shroud was finally being burned away by the raw, human drama of a dynasty in collapse. Each player on the field was now fighting their own private battle. The striker, who had scored at will in the opening rounds, was now dropping deep, hunting for touches he hadn't needed before, his confidence visibly draining with every unsuccessful challenge. The defenders, once the bedrock of the team's invincibility, were resorting to desperate, lunging tackles that bordered on the reckless. They were no longer the apex predators of world football. They were a group of isolated individuals, overwhelmed by the realization that the machine was truly, irrevocably dead. The final whistle was still 45 minutes away, but for everyone inside that arena, the game had already reached its conclusion. The facade had been stripped away, and underneath it lay not the cold, perfect tactical structure that the world had feared, but a group of exhausted, disillusioned human beings. The corporate fantasy was over, the marketing narrative was in tatters, and the history books would now have to record the death of the most feared team in World Cup history, not with a whimper, but with the loud, public sound of a machine breaking down under the weight of its own impossible expectations. The final whistle that confirmed their defeat in the World Cup final was not just the end of a match. It was the definitive, thunderous collapse of a reality that the world had accepted as truth. For weeks, we had watched them operate as an extension of an unstoppable, mechanical system, a team so perfectly engineered that their victory felt like a cosmic certainty. But in those final 90 minutes, the machine had seized, the gears had been stripped, and the human beings beneath the surface had finally reclaimed their voices, even if it was through the lens of a painful, public surrender. As the opposing team celebrated their own improbable triumph, the members of the losing squad stood in the center of the pitch, their neon-colored kits looking strangely muted under the artificial stadium lights. The invincibility was gone. The terror was neutralized. What remained was a group of men who, in the aftermath of their failure, looked startlingly, tragically human. The cameras lingered on their faces, not the masks of focus they had worn for the entire tournament, but expressions of deep, bone-weary resignation. The legacy of this team is a paradox that will be debated by football historians for decades. On one hand, they pushed the tactical and physical boundaries of the sport further than any group in history. They demonstrated that, with the right combination of state-level resources, biometric analysis, and total psychological suppression, you could build a team that was technically untouchable. But on the other hand, they served as a cautionary tale about the cost of that pursuit. By treating the beautiful game as an engineering challenge, they lost sight of the reason why the sport captivates billions: the beautiful, chaotic, and utterly human struggle that defines a true sporting achievement. They became the scariest team in history not because of their talent, but because they tried to delete the very humanity that makes football a sport worth dying for. They tried to turn a game of passion into a game of processing, and in the end, that is exactly why they couldn't endure. The game, in its infinite wisdom, eventually rejected them, forcing the machine to break before it could claim the final, ultimate prize. Where are they now? The aftermath of that final was a rapid, quiet dispersal. The coaching staff was dismantled within weeks, their methodologies suddenly viewed as relics of a failed, overly rigid era. The players, once the envy of the sporting world, found themselves grappling with the trauma of their own public unraveling, their reputations forever linked to the night the machine stopped running. Some moved to smaller clubs, desperate to rediscover the simple, unburdened love for the game they had left behind in the pressure cooker of that training camp. Others retired prematurely, unable to reconcile the athlete they had been forced to become with the person they actually were. They are a ghost story of the modern game, a reminder that in our quest for perfect analytics and total control, we risk destroying the very thing that makes football the most popular sport on the planet, the possibility of the impossible. They taught us that perfection is not a goal to be achieved, but a cage to be escaped. As we close this chapter of the Football Archive, we are left to ponder the nature of our own obsession with dominance and order. We crave the machine because it is predictable, because it provides the data points we use to measure greatness, but we love the sport because it is chaotic, because it breaks hearts, and because it is defined by the very errors we try to engineer away. This team was a spectacular anomaly, a glitch in the history of football that forced us to question what we truly want from our heroes. Did we want them to be perfect, or did we want them to be real? Their story, hidden beneath the surface of the highlight reels, is a testament to the fact that every legend carries a shadow, a private cost that the audience rarely sees. If this deep dive into the anatomy of fear and the price of perfection resonated with your passion for the truth behind the highlights, subscribe to the Football Archive. We have spent countless hours in the dark, scouring for the stories that most channels skip, all to ensure that you never miss the real history of the beautiful game. The machine may be broken, but the story of football is never finished. We are already deep into the archives, hunting for the next untold mystery, the next fallen giant, and the next legend whose story has yet to be fully revealed. Thank you for walking this path with us. See you in the next one. Bye.